You, Simon Rose, author, writer, editor, consultant. You've written more than 5 or 10 books, as I gather.
100 and hang on, wait a minute. About 150, yeah.
150. Okay, and I'll just let everyone know we do have a period of questions at the end here, and if you want to put your questions in chat, we highly encourage that. We're happy to answer questions. Oh, and we got the UK signing in here. Hello.
Excellent.
And Seattle and Calgary. And I'll just type in any questions. Please type them in.
I won't look at any. I won't look at any questions at all until we're done, of course, because at least I'll be able to look at them and see what they are, I suppose. But we won't be able to answer any of them until the end.
Okay. Yeah, and you can jump in, and we are live at 3:02 p.m.
Well, hello everyone. I don't know how many people we've got in this thing. It's always interesting when we do these online conventions. But Simon Rose is the name here, and as Jennifer was saying, I have written quite a lot of books. I've written 18 novels, including a series that is going to be published this fall. I'm not going to show you all the covers of my books. I was hoping to have a sign behind me with all my book covers on it, but unfortunately that is probably being operated by Shure technology because it's not working either. Interesting. Friday the 13th for me. It's part of the time travel thing. I think that's maybe what it is. But I do have, I will show you these books though, which are just here. These are the latest ones that I've done. These are the this is the flashback series. If you can see that, that's a paranormal series. It's there's another couple of books in that series there. The last series I actually put out myself, self-published, was this one here, the Shadow Zone series. There's 3 of those as well, a little trilogy about parallel universes and things like that. The new series is going to all be about historical fantasy set in the English Civil War, and I'm currently also working on a alternate history, which we might be able to touch on in this session. Alternate history series set in the beginning, early years of World War II, as well as the novels. I've written 8 writers' guides, tips and advice and things like that for aspiring and established authors. The Children's Writers Guide came out a few years ago, and this imaginatively titled The Children's Writers 2 came out more recently. But again, tips and advice for writers. This one's a bit more relevant to today's session, I suppose. This is called The Time Traveler's Guide, and this has tips and advice for writers of historical fiction and time travel stories. As I said, the non-fiction books I've written, some of them have been on historical topics and things, and they've mostly been for young adults as well. And there's, I think it's about 120 of those or something like that. All this stuff's on the website if anyone's interested when we're all done. In addition to all this, goodness knows where I find the time, but I also work as a writing instructor at the University of Calgary throughout the year. Got some stuff lined up for the fall. As well as earlier in this year, I was doing things too. And I work as an editor and a coach and consultant for all sorts of writers in all genres as well. So now, time travel. It's time for time travel, I suppose. Now, although I have said it's in the title of this session, it mentions that time travel is not just a thing of the past. It's just because it is such a large topic. I will simply be covering travel from the present to the past in this session because it's very, very complicated, and we're going to get into all sorts of muddles if we start looking at travel to the future and people traveling from the future back to here and things like that. So in this one, we're just going to focus on traveling from where we are now, or wherever the present day is in the story, back into the past and everything like that. It's been popular for a long time, time travel. It continues to be so. And a time travel device, excuse me, a time travel device in these sort of stories can be a machine. We're familiar with it being a time machine, I suppose. But it doesn't have to be machinery. It can just be any sort of device, really, or it can be just some sort of a method of traveling in time. It can be anything, really. I mean, it's from your imagination. It can also be scientific, and it can involve technology, or of course, it can also be magical. We've seen that before in stories as well. Now, a few examples. There's lots of examples, of course. But the ones I sort of was often mentioned because people are familiar with them in the I think it's in one of the Harry Potter books anyway. I think it's the Harry Potter and the Prisoner of Azkaban. I think there's this device called the Time Turner. I think it's called, and it's an hourglass if I remember correctly. And he turns it upside down, and it allows him to travel back in time, but for a limited period. So there's that element of time running out during a time travel adventure, I suppose. There is that going on. So that's a common theme in stories. Also, of course, back in my youth, and some people are still following this today, there's Doctor Who himself, who's a British, obviously science fiction character, who's been around since, let me think, about 1962, I think, 1963. And they keep changing the actor who plays it and all that sort of thing. But he has a device which travels, well, he doesn't just travel in time, does he? He travels in space as well, but he does travel in time. But it's a time travel device, I think.
Well, I have to jump in here. I have to jump in here. You have to say it. It's a TARDIS, and it's interdimensional. Anyways, and Doctor Who is a she at the moment, but not for long.
Is that it? Are you finished now?
Sorry.
About Doctor Who? Okay. I didn't realize it was going to be like that. In Star Trek, of course, that's quite a there's been various incarnations of time travel in Star Trek, of course. In the one I remember lots of them really, but obviously there was spaceship flying through space and all that sort of stuff. But there was an episode with Kirk and Spock and McCoy and everything back in the 60s where they went back in time through a portal on an alien planet. I remember that one, about 1968, 69, something like that. The City on the Edge of Forever, I think it was called. A very famous time travel episode in time travel, literature and movies and stuff. What else do we have? Oh yes, the superhero genre. I read a lot of comic books around the same time. There was an awful lot of comic book examples of time travel, and we saw them recently as quite important elements in the Avengers movies and those superhero movies that came out in recent years. Back to the Future. Everybody seems to know about Back to the Future. In the days when I was still visiting schools and young writers conferences and things like that, children still seem to know about Back to the Future. So that's nice, actually. It's nice to see that they know about this particular time travel trilogy or time travel method with the car and all that sort of stuff. There's another one that's become very familiar to people in recent years, whether they've read the books or not, is Outlander, of course, which is where the main characters travel to 18th century Scotland to the time of the Battle of Culloden and the Jacobite Rebellion and all that sort of stuff. At first, anyway, through standing stones in Scotland. What's the other one? Oh yes, the one that is that I remembered that was an interesting concept. Was a movie that came out. Oh, must be 20 years ago now, and the movie was called Frequency. I can't remember who's in it now, but it was a boy was like a ham radio enthusiast or something like that, whatever that means these days, I suppose. And he was able to connect with his father. Deceased father in the past through the magic of radio waves, I suppose, and then he was going to try and save his life, and things, which is again common theme in time travel stories, I suppose. In fact, if I can find the thing here, where's my? Oh yes, here we go. Excuse me, one moment. Wasn't quite ready for this. This book of mine here is called Future Imperfect. Came out in a few years ago, not too many years ago. And in this one, that was a sort of updated version of this in some ways, because in this one, the main character gets messages from the future through an app on his cell phone. which was inspired, I think it was inspired by when people were still, well, they probably still are, where people were able to sort of send us things, just like they used to send us emails. They started sending us apps to download on our cell phones and things, and whole albums from bands and things like that. And I thought, well, then there's an awful lot of apps on my phone that I don't either. Sometimes I don't even know what they are or what they do and things. But in this, yes, he's getting messages, I think, from his future self. And it's telling him things he should do to make the future happen in a certain way, or to be able to change the future because it's awful, by doing something in the present day. So there's all sorts of elements to time travel stories. In my own books, I can tell you about some of the methods in those. In this one here, in the Alchemist Portrait, the very first book I ever wrote. This was or published anyway. In this one, the main character travels through time. He travels through the frames of paintings in a museum, which act as doorways, portals into the past, and everything like that. But he can only, of course, travel to, well, I shouldn't say of course, but he can only travel to the area in the past where the painting existed. So he can't go back to the time of the dinosaurs and things like that because the painting hadn't already been done. These are sort of some of the things you have to think about when you're doing time travel stories. It has to make sense and it has to be logical, even though it's not a logical idea. So he can, and he steps into the painting, and then when he steps out of the painting, it's like a doorway, and he's stepping out to wherever the painting was displayed on the wall in the past. But if it was painted in, I think it was painted in the year 1665, something like that. So he's unable to go back to the year 1660, for example, because that was before the painting existed. And I had to consider those things when I was writing the story. In the second one, which was this also time travel element in this one, the Sorcerer's Letterbox was set in medieval England. In this story, the main character is exchanging letters with the boy king Edward V, who was imprisoned in the Tower of London by the King Richard III, along with his younger brother. And didn't survive, of course, him and his brother, and they became known as the Princes in the Tower, a famous historical mystery, I suppose. But the main character is exchanging letters in a drawer in the bottom of a little box. And then to travel back in time, he's traveling back in time. He's turning a wheel that goes counterclockwise and travels back in time with the box, which is an important element to the portability of the time travel device, which I'll hopefully get to. Yes, we should have time to get to that as well. The one about the Black Death. Yes, I have a book about the Black Death as well. Also medieval England, but a bit earlier. The other one's set in the time of the Princes of the Tower in 1483. This one takes place in 1349, at the height of the Black Death in Britain and in Europe. And in this one, the time travel device is a gemstone that she has to on a necklace that she has to fit back together in two halves to go back to 1349. Interestingly, I'd mentioned earlier about this lovely paranormal book, because this one, although it is paranormal and it's about psychics and ghosts and all that sort of stuff, there's also a time travel element or a time shifting sort of element to this one as well. But the interesting thing about it is that although people are going back in time, or he's going back in time, he goes back to only goes back to the mid 1990s, which doesn't seem like that long ago, perhaps to some people, but of course it is now. It's what, 20, is it 25 years ago? I suppose it is now, isn't it? 1995, long time ago. And in that story, the method of him traveling in time involves he is helped by a psychic medium who knows about things like hypnotic regression into previous lives, which I thought was a fascinating topic to use for a book, and I'd always wanted to, and so I decided I would try and use it for this thing. And so that's got a time travel element to it as well. So there's lots of different methods you can use, but you have to be, as I've said before, you have to be specific on how it works, because just like in anything else, if your story doesn't have plausible stuff in it, whether it's for adults or whether it's for children, if it has elements in it that don't make any sense, it's going to ruin the story. Some people aren't, even children, they might not bother finishing the story, or they might just decide it's not a very good one and tell everybody else that as well. So you have to be very careful with that. even if your story is fictional, even if the method of time travel in it is fictional, it still has to make sense, even if the whole idea, it doesn't make any sense at all. I mean, for example, what we have here is the world famous time traveling water bottle. Well, it's not world famous, but it's my water bottle right here. Now, the thing is this, if I'm able to use this water bottle to travel in time, what is it that is magical about it? Is it the bottle itself, or is it the water? You might think, well, does it matter? Even especially in a kid's story, does it matter? Well, yes, it does in some ways, because if it's the bottle that is magical, then obviously you can fill that bottle with just about anything you want, and it will magically have this power to do whatever it's supposed to do. But if it's the water that's magical, and it comes from some special spring in the present day or something, or from the fridge or whatever it does, once that water runs out, or it could just evaporate in the heat, or anything, or the bottle's broken, anything could happen, then you're really quite stuck there. So it has to make sense. Again, as I said, even if the whole idea of time travel doesn't seem to make much sense at all. I mean, I did mention portability a little bit earlier on, and that's important too. This is why we see, not in every story, of course, but we do see a lot of rings and jewelry and necklaces and things like that in time travel type stories. Often, if the character needs to take something with them to the past and then use it again to get back to the present day, you can't. Well, I suppose you could if you wanted to. I suppose you could have a time traveling couch or an armchair and go back in time or something, but you wouldn't be able to carry it around with you without being noticed very, very easily. So portability is important, and it's all part of the plausibility of the story as well. If it's a ring or a piece of jewelry or something like that, it could be a family heirloom. It could be something like that, or it could be connected to the family in some way. But also the time traveling jewelry like that could just be completely random. I mean, an example of a plot, I wouldn't say a typical plot, because it really isn't one. But if you've got an example plot, straightforward for a time travel story, might be that somebody finds this mysterious object, they go back in time, they have their adventure back in time, then the object is usually broken or stolen or lost or runs out of power in some way, giving us a sense of urgency until the main characters go back home early, that sort of thing. But the thing is, there are other aspects as well that you have to watch out for, and make sure you have in these time travel stories, and make sure you're clear on for you and for the reader. Is it an accidental trip to the past, or is there a special mission of some sort? Do they have to rescue someone or perform some sort of task in the past, which is what happens in my story about the paintings? Do they need to change history in some way to make the future happen, or make it happen in a different way? And also, you've got to think about the era that these people are going to visit as well, because most of my books have been for sort of young adult readers, early teens, that sort of thing, I suppose. But you can't be sloppy on the research into the historical period that people are going to, just because the readers are going to be younger, that's for sure. Because just as people are going to study that imaginary technology that you've invented, they're also going to study the historical research. And just remember that the people who, yes, children, I suppose, will review your books and maybe tell people about it. But the people who review books are usually adults, and at least, well, I suppose maybe even today as well, but certainly back in the old days, reviewers of books were often teachers and librarians and people like that, people who were quite influential, I suppose. And in those days, 20 years ago, something like that, you would have reviews and things appearing in library journals and literary magazines and things like that. And if your research has been sort of a little bit off and not quite accurate enough, then there's going to be a bad review. And but now, of course, the review would probably be posted on Amazon, elsewhere online, and you might not see it for quite some time, and then you'll be wondering why your book hasn't sold very well. So the research is very, very important to get done. correctly. The one about the paintings, I had to study about the history of art. I had to study about in the first half of the 17th century in Europe in general, but specifically I was interested in early 17th century Amsterdam in the Netherlands. I had to study the French Revolution, American Civil War, and the Russian Revolution. Now, I have a degree in history and everything, but it doesn't mean I know everything. Of course it doesn't. And there are lots of things, there are lots of topics I studied quite deeply during my school and university years and everything, and some that I've only become as familiar with or interested in later on. So I always had to do research into these things, even if I was aware of the dates when these things happened and everything. The Sorcerer's Letterbox involved lots of research into the Wars of the Roses, the finer details of the reign of Richard III, the Princes in the Tower mystery I was quite familiar with, but not all the details of that. The medieval period in general, what life was like, what people, obviously clothing and weaponry and things, but also what people used to do, how people used to live in general, what general life was like in a specific time too. You're talking about 1483, so we're talking about the second half or the last few decades of the 15th century. And a lot of the action, well, I say a lot of the action, but some significant scenes in the story take place in the Tower of London. And in the Tower of London, we're familiar with it. If some of us have visited it, and some of us have seen it in photographs and on television and things like that in film. But the Tower of London has been there for quite some time. But it's looked similar. I wouldn't say the same. It's looked similar, at least from the outside, I suppose, for quite some time. But the thing is, there were certain things that weren't there in 1483 that were probably there in the Elizabethan period. For example, when we've seen images from the Tudor times of people, arriving in a boat, when they're going to be imprisoned in the tower before they're going to be executed or something like that. It's a familiar scene we've seen on screen many times and things. But I believe that during my research, I had found that didn't exist in 1483, so you couldn't use it because it would have been great to be able to use that in the story itself, but it wouldn't have been historically accurate. So you have to make sure that you think, well, it's the medieval period, it's the Middle Ages, it must be the same. Well, no, I'm afraid it isn't. You've got to do lots of research into that and make sure you know that you're doing it correctly. I mean, there was one thing I had a scene once where somebody was going over to one of the windows in the tower and opening I wanted them to open the window to breathe in some fresh air, and because they were sort of shocked that they traveled back in time to the Middle Ages. And I knew from my own youth and visiting of historic places in the UK that in the Tudor period, Elizabethan period, around 1600, I suppose, that sort of time, 1590s, there was glass in windows where you would be able, in houses anyway, I don't know about castles, where you would be able to lift a little latch and then push it open and open the window. But I couldn't find out if it did that exist in 1483, and if I include that in there, is some critic going to look at that and say, well, this hasn't been done right? So eventually I just had the person go to the window and gulp in some fresh air and left it at that. Another thing I came across in that book as well was the printed books, because I had one of the characters reading a book, and again, I knew that printing had been invented not like the previous year or something. Printing had been coming in. Printed books were arriving on the scene, not for everybody, of course, at that time, because it was very new and probably very expensive. But I thought, well, he's a prince of the realm, and then he's the young king of England, so the chances of him having access to one of the first printed books is probably quite likely. So I thought, well, I'll just say he was reading a book. The one about the Black Death, I had to look into archaeological digs for that one, what they're like in the present day, what sort of things people look for, what sort of tools they use. That was more of a modern day thing. Medieval period again was similar to 1483, I suppose, but it is not. It's more than 100. It's like 150 years before that, so you have to be careful with your research for that. The Black Death, of course, itself, what it was like. what it would have looked like to someone who saw someone who had the Black Death. But my character in the story is she's aware of some early medical techniques and things like that. But it was important to note that during that time period as well, people would still be dealing with superstition and things like that as well, quite a lot back in 1349. So if somebody arrives and says, "Oh, I've got this wonderful paste or something that I've made from a certain plant that's going to be able to ease the pain from this horrible plague that you've got," it won't cure it, but it'll help you out and ease the pain. And the people would be asking this woman, "Well, do you have your astrological chart with you, or shall we wait till the full moon?" and things like that, because people were still doing that kind of thing for quite some time, but certainly around then at that time too. Now, I mentioned earlier about the paranormal one in 1995, which when that idea first came to me, I suppose it was, I don't know, early about 2002, something like that, 2003, and 1995 was recent history, not ancient history. But back then, of course, if the internet was existed, it would have been, certainly was in its infancy in 1995, that's for sure. And although we didn't have those house brick sized cell phones in 1995, cell phones, mobile phones were not as prevalent certainly as they are today, and texting and things like that. When the character is in the present day, yes, he's able to text and use a cell phone and all the rest of it, but not in 1995. Also, one thing you find back then as well, which you'll see everywhere now, I suppose, or hear everywhere now, is overhead music, of course. You hear that just about everywhere, supermarkets and just about everywhere. I suppose we're used to it now. It's all over the place, but that wasn't as prevalent except in December, probably, back in the mid-90s. But another thing that I had to include in the story was the prevalence of smoking as well. Because people in those days, you could not that everybody smoked, but people could smoke in a lot more places than they can now. So that had to be part of it. Now, my host is nodding here, and I'm going to ask you a question here, because I think maybe I already asked you this when we were doing the testing, but one of the, I think it was McDonald's, but it might have been A&W here in Canada. Somebody had little like tinfoil ashtrays on the tables in those restaurants back then, didn't they? Do you remember that or not? No? Oh, can't hear you. You've gone muted. I have to...
Sorry, I just didn't want to interrupt.
No, it's okay. I was just curious, because you're my person here who lives in the same city. So I think it was McDonald's. I seem to remember the M on this little silver ashtray.
Well, I remember that at some point they Calgary, where we're at, brought in a bylaw that prevented smoking in public places. And that included places like McDonald's and
yes.
It used to be you could and for me it was difficult because I have asthma, but used to be you would walk into a pub or a restaurant and lots of people would be smoking all the time, right? And then they had the bylaws. So but I guess again that would be a location thing with reference to time travel, because the whole smoking thing, I think, was exercised in different ways in different places. So definitely that would be something to include in your research for sure.
And something you wouldn't really think about if you thought, well, I'm going to set a story in the 80s or the 70s would seem like an awful long time ago. So we see people from the 60s and 70s in photographs and things that people smoked anywhere, and you could smoke on buses and trains, and planes had a smoking section at the back and things like that. So these things are funny. And because because we don't see much of it anymore because there's so many restrictions on it. But I had to include that, and it also turned out to be I had to have one of my adult characters. One of the main young character. I had to have him on his own to sneak into the back of this this vehicle so that he could go somewhere he wasn't supposed to do that was too dangerous. And I had to get the adult out of the way. And he'd already said, no, you have to go home. It's too dangerous for you. And I thought, well, what's he going to do now? He's going to get into his pickup truck. And how is this kid going to climb into the back of this pickup truck? All about plausibility again. I couldn't have that guy then. It took me quite a while to work out what to do with him. And then he said, oh, I forgot my cigarettes. I left them on the table in there. So he went back in to get his cigarettes and the problem was solved. But then that meant I had to change the story a bit earlier on and have him smoking while they were chatting in McDonald's or whatever. But it was all part, I wouldn't have known that without doing the research. The Civil War one. Go ahead.
I'm going to jump in here just to let you know that one of our viewers, Rhonda, said McDonald's definitely did have the ashtrays.
I knew it was there. Yeah, because I seem to remember. I remember the golden,
the magic M, and then Janet from the UK says that restaurants in the UK and cafes were mixed smoking and non-smoking in the 90s.
Yes, and the person from the UK, as somebody else was telling me the other day as well, in the UK, you used to be able to, of course, on double-decker buses in every town and city in England, you used to be able to smoke upstairs on a bus. Certainly in the 70s, because I remember that, and maybe, I don't know how long that lasted too, but smoking was allowed on buses. Of course, not that that was before people realized, I guess, that smoke would drift everywhere and it didn't just stay upstairs and behave itself. It went everywhere, I suppose. But with the research into the further back historical stuff, the Civil War thing, I had to do lots of research into 17th century England, living conditions, clothing, etc. Charles I's trial and the execution and the end of the monarchy, and then when it came back later on, Civil War and battles and all that sort of stuff, and the political ideas of the time and what people were thinking of. That was important to know about all that. And the one I'm working on now, which is set in the early years of World War II, is again, I have to know about the events of the time, whether they're going to be part of the story or just in the background that people are talking about or are aware of. But also, you've got to think about things like rationing. You know, what were certain foods weren't available, and you've got to think about the Blitz and air raid shelters and all this sort of stuff. Because this story is set in 1940 and 1941, so it's at that sort of time, Battle of Britain and Dunkirk and all that sort of stuff in this story. So there is all that to consider as well. Now, I have to point this out because I'm sure somebody might in the question period, or maybe what time is it? Oh, we've got a bit of time here. I should also mention, actually, I've now lost it here. Oh, here we go. Yes. Time travel story. Yes, this was going to depend on how much time we had, but it is interesting that it's one of these things that when people write time travel stories, and it may sometimes the ones I get sent to me to assess or to edit and things. It's one of the things I've seen more than once is when people don't get the names right. You know, they've got somebody from the present traveling to the past, and they can have a modern name. The boys and the girls, they can have modern names if it's a kid's story or even adults. But if characters are the characters that are based in the Middle Ages themselves, they were born and raised there and they lived all of their lives there, they have to have names that are appropriate to the time period, whether it's the Middle Ages or whether it's some other sort of time period. And it's easy to find out names that you'll still see today, really, for men and women, from kings and queens usually, and famous people that there are paintings of. You've got your and names that we still see around today. We still see Henry, Thomas, and William, and Richard, and Elizabeth, and Mary, and Anne are very names we know of, but they were much more common back then, I guess. But also, back then, you might have had quite a lot of men wandering around with a name like Walter or Hugh, which we don't see very often now, or Joan or Matilda. And you might think, well, who would call themselves that? It's not a very common name. Well, in those days it was. You have to be aware of that. If you said a story in the early 18th century or at the Jane Austen era, you can just go for that sort of time period, the Bronte sisters and the Jane Austen era. You've got lots of names there as well. that you can choose from. You've got your Charlottes and your Louisas and your Emilys and your Charles and your James and things like that, which are all very nice and appropriate for that time period. World War II, if you've got, which I'm just working with, of course, in this latest thing, it's easy to find names that would have been popular in World War II online, to be perfectly honest. All you've got to do is look at names, baby names. If it's British, I suppose, if it's a British story, you would go and look at what British baby names were popular between 1910 and 1920 for boys and girls, and then these people are then going to be adults in the early 1940s. So if you've got a man who's been captured by the Germans and he's in a prison camp somewhere and he's writing to his wife or his girlfriend in England to tell her how he's doing, I mean, he might be Jack or Bob or Harry or Bert or Charlie or Jim. But he might also, and the person he's writing to might be Doris, Phyllis, Betty, or Rita, something like that. Nice and appropriate for the time. But if you make it, it's all part of that plausibility thing, really, with I mentioned earlier with your time travel stories. If you're going to have a story like that set in the past, make sure it's relevant to the time period. And also you've got to think too as well, which is something I'd consider for my latest one as well. If you've got social status also can sometimes be reflected with names as well, because sometimes if you've got depending on what sort of job someone did or what sort of class of society they were in World War II, they might have been known as Robert rather than Bob. Or Charles instead of Charlie. So that's something to consider as well. And before I leave off that topic, I should mention that it's interesting that there are some names that we see today for people. If you see somebody's name on a business card or on a website or something like certain names, you usually get a good idea of how old somebody is just from the name, really, sometimes, because it might be a name that's currently out of fashion and was very popular at a certain time. I mean, you've got people, there are some names you don't see as often now. You don't see Brian very often for babies. You don't see Keith, and you don't see Gary, for example. And sometimes if you see names like that, you think, well, these people are going to be 50 plus. I don't want to upset anyone in the audience here, but I don't see my name very often either for younger people. I don't see Simon very often. You don't see Stephen very often for younger people. And I went to school with an awful lot of Stephens and Andrews and Michaels when I was a kid. And you don't see many Sharons today either, and Carols and Lindas. These are all names that sort of were popular for young girls, probably in the late 50s and early 60s, and now not so much. Well, we're okay for time still, I think, because one thing, again, I keep saying there's lots of things I have to mention. That's the problem with time travel talks. When people who are scientifically minded, and not particularly science fiction minded, start thinking about time travel, they will often tell you why time travel is never going to be possible and it's complete fantasy. And they'll talk about what they call the grandfather paradox, which some of us will be familiar with if we know about time travel. And I suppose the basics of that theory is that if you could go back in time, you could either accidentally or purposefully kill your ancestor so that you never existed to go back there in the first place to do that.
Uh-oh.
Exactly. Yes. Always right. And that's the thing. So you think, so it's impossible. So why has anyone ever bothered to write about time travel? And the answer is because it's such a cool idea, and everyone, and not only that, everyone still seems to like it. The number of time travel films and things that have been written, books that have been written, and movies and TV shows that continue to be made. People, and sometimes people, I've seen sometimes when people will watch a time travel show and they'll think, well, that's impossible. That would never work. So do they reach for the remote and turn it off? No, they keep watching it, don't they? Because they enjoy it.
In the nick of time. I'm going to carry on here, Simon, because now we've got two things pending. So initially, somebody had asked at the beginning, do you do young adult books?
Yes, my books are for young adults. Yes, I guess some of them were earlier ones was probably for middle grade, but now I suppose, yes, we're looking at young adults, probably 12 to 14, 15, something at the most. That's more or less what I'm doing. But I don't exclusively watch time travel stories for young adults and things like that. So that's the stuff I've been writing. I sort of fell into as a writer, but I've been interested in all sorts of things for quite some time. But that's my primary, I suppose, thing. The writer's guides that I showed you earlier, those are not for younger. Those are for grown-ups. And I write other things for grown-ups too. I write scripts and screenplays and goodness knows what else. But the novels mostly for, yes, that sort of age range, yes.
Whew. Excellent, excellent. And I have another question.
Yes.
From Dawn. How could we contact you for manuscript reading? I'm a Canadian debut author with a time travel setting in 1482 Kidderminster.
How can they say? They know that I know all about that place. I don't really, but I could though, couldn't I?
We could say go to your
anybody
website.
I have a website, of course. On my website, there's a contact thingy that you can click on. You can also just search on my name. Probably best to put the word author after it sometimes if you want to on the internet, and you'll find websites, you'll find a Facebook page, you'll probably find me on Twitter and Instagram and all sorts of different places like that. And also, I believe in this, and Jennifer will correct me if I'm wrong here, but in that online bookstore that we have here, I think I had to put my email address in, or at least a website thing. So it's on the When Words Collide online stuff. There's contact information as well, isn't there?
Can we put your email in?
If not, you put your website in for sure. So if somebody would like to contact me, yes, if you want to contact me through Facebook or through the convention or through the website, yes, I am easy to find. Yes. And I'd be happy to chat with someone about that particular thing or anything else for that matter. Yes.
And I'll just say for one, I have teens, so I'm going to be buying some more books.
Good Lord. I'm just trying to think if I've got anything on. Oh, yes. What was I going to say? I was going to say something important here. Oh, yes. That was it. About the fact that it's a cool topic and people want to keep writing about it. Now, and again, this is a massive topic to discuss here, but I have seen quite a few stories, mostly not so much books, but mostly things, TV shows and movies, where the author has come up with some rules of his own or her own during the time travel process of writing the story, because they've said, well, this person isn't allowed to change this, or they're not allowed to do that, and then because they don't want to change things in the future to make things different, or they'll create alternate timelines and things like that. So it can be, there's lots of things that have been invented like that in stories, if only to silence all those scientific people who say, well, it's not possible to travel in time because you could do this sort of stuff. And it's like, well, yes, but people still want to read about it. Let's be honest. So it's a complex topic. I suppose I should probably open up the floor for nothing but questions now, because and thank everyone for coming at some point.
And we're at the 5-minute mark, and I want to say, wow, did that ever go fast?
Oh, it did, didn't it? Actually, that was very strange. I was thinking. 1 minute it was 3:25. I looked at my clock and plenty of time. We've got plenty of time here. But yes, I was about to say, I suppose, thank you for listening or watching, I suppose, in this case. Normally, I would have done this. In fact, I did do 2 years ago. I did this for the last time at When Words Collide, a similar thing to this. And it was probably an hour or just over an hour. It might have stretched over an hour with questions and things. And it was mostly a lot of the same topics and things. But some things I was able to delve a bit deeper into, I suppose. And I'm looking forward to us going back live in person, but at some point. But we're at the mercy of other things. I think Jennifer had mentioned we have some people from the UK. I'm sure you're going through similar things to what we are here. we are all optimistic that things will improve and that life will return to however normal it can be. But we are at the mercy of other things, other factors, I think. Some of these books are for sale, I think, in the online bookstore that is attached to the convention. If not, all my books are available on Amazon. They're available other places online as ebooks. I think they're all available as ebooks now, ebooks and as print books. And I have some copies, all copies of all of them myself. If anyone is, local, I'm happy to deliver them now. I will form it. It's like skip the dishes for food. I'll deliver books to people's houses because then they can be signed. You see, that's the thing. And I say social media of various kinds, a search on the internet, a search on the convention website or my own website will get you to me. And then we can take it from there. So, yes. So back to you with the funky glasses.
Yes, I love these. These are so much fun.
Yes.
So I have to ask the question, and because you really put it out there, will there be another time travel book from you?
Well, the thing is, I can't say too much, can I? But there's a time travel element. I'll just say that. In my series about the Civil War involving the King's execution and the Civil War thing, there is a time travel element to that, especially in the third one. But I'm not allowed to say any more than that. Otherwise, I may be executed myself by the characters.
So that sounds like a promising maybe.
Not allowed to say that at all. But I'm thinking those books, the first one will probably, I'm thinking of putting that out in... I know that if this is recorded and it's online later, it's currently August of 2021. If I'm thinking of putting out the first book before Christmas, not in December, probably November if I can. And then the second, but I won't put out all three out at once. I'd probably put out the second one, keep people hanging on a cliffhanger until March or something of the following year, and then do the third one, in the summer or something. I don't know yet. It's all, but the first one I really do want to get out in 2021. And then, of course, I've got that World War II one, which is 2/3 done, not properly edited, but the actual story and everything is done. It just needs fixing up. So always plenty to do.
Absolutely.
Do we have any more questions for anyone else there? No, we don't.
Last chance for questions. And by the way, I can confirm Simon is on Facebook. So yes, you can find him there.
Look at that. I've got the little window open here, and it says there's my website. Yes, they are mixed smoking. Oh, we did all that. We did all that earlier, didn't we? Yes.
Yeah. Yes, yeah. It's last chance for questions, and then I guess we can just cross our fingers and hope that we can do in-person book signings come November when you come out with your next book.
Well, I'm hoping to. The interesting thing was I actually received an email or message, I suppose, from through LinkedIn, which is something I'm on, but I pay little attention to. And this is somebody in LinkedIn. They're a teacher somewhere in Canada, and they sent me a letter. And I thought, oh, what it's just a happy birthday or happy fall or something. But she was asking me, this lady was asking me, where can I get your new books about the English Civil War? And I thought, oh, well, they're not out yet. You've seen the covers on LinkedIn and everything. The covers are available on Facebook, that's for sure. I did post the covers for people to look at because the artist just got back to me with those. And so there isn't much to do. The hold up on those books is me. They're edited and everything. It's the design work and everything that's me. I'm holding it up. So, but we're also busy with this, aren't we? We're busy with this wonderful thing. Oh, of course, because it's a convention, one thing I haven't mentioned is, although I'm talking about time travel today, tomorrow morning, I think it is, I am talking about writing historical fiction on one of these thingies. But it's more of a presentation and I'm in charge of it. So goodness knows how that will work out because I will not have Jennifer's guiding hand and I could be at the mercy of Zoom. That's at 10, I think, but I think it's at 10, could be at 11, but it's on the website. And then I've got another one on writing for children and young adults, which I was just looking at this morning, and it seems to be in good shape. That's at either, I think that's at 4 o'clock tomorrow. So
10 o'clock and 4 o'clock.
There you go. I also did some blue pencil sessions editing sessions for aspiring writers and things this previous week, actually, which normally with that, as Jennifer will know, with blue pencil sessions at When Words Collide, usually people like me get to meet the author and to give them some feedback on the thing they've been sent. About 10 minutes, maybe. You don't get much time, but that's always been great. But we've been able to do that, fortunately, by email and Zoom/phone and things as well this week as well. So it's not ideal as being online, but it does work because I suppose we're all techie people, even if we're not tech experts. We've been, as in the writering world, we seem to be used to technology to some degree, don't we? So yes. Anyway, I'll stop jabbering on and hand it back to you.
Okay, and what time? What's the 4 o'clock show about?
Oh, that's writing for children and young adults.
Writing for children. Okay, and that's on Saturday, right?
They're both on Saturday, yes. And but anybody who's thinking of going to some of these, there's definitely some overlap with what we've been talking about here with the historical fiction one. But I think mentioned very early on in that presentation that I'm going to try, whether you've been here or not today, I'm going to try. I may delve into time travel for 5 minutes, but I try and avoid it because we're not supposed to be talking about that. We're supposed to be talking about history and research and stuff. And the children and young adults one, same thing. It's mostly about writing for children and young adults, age counts, word counts, and the age of the readers and things like that, and plotting and editing and goodness knows what else. Again, try and avoid time travel with that. I think historical research slips into it slightly because it has to, but I may not mention McDonald's ashtrays again.
Well, very good. Thank you so much. Thank you so
everyone.
much. What a great job.
Enjoy the rest of your time. Bye-bye.
We look forward to seeing you in November. Thanks a lot.
Thank you. Thank you.